I know how tempted you are to hit that bargain bin, that reduced rack, that clearance section, but I'm begging you, it is not worth it. You're putting the rest of your houseplant collection at risk just to save a few bucks. You might be looking for that great deal or a challenging rescue mission, but the best plants always start from the healthiest cuttings. Hey great, you found a homeless monstera on the street, but congratulations, because now you have thrips. Now you have thrips. Plants from big box stores aren't meant to stay on the shelves for long. They could be under low light conditions, or employees are instructed to water them under a specific schedule that is just enough to keep them healthy enough to sell. But if this schedule goes on for long enough, like weeks or months at a time, that's exactly when the plants start to weaken, and then they become susceptible to pests or bacterial infections. These pest bacteria or fungal infections know exactly when a plant has a weakened immune system, and that's when they strike. You have a much higher chance of bringing plants with pests home that can infest the rest of your collection with plants that are on clearance. You could even be bringing bacterial or fungal infections home like a rust fungus or powdery mildew. Infected plants lose leaves and don't grow well, so hack number 1 is to always start with healthy plants or cuttings. In the plant challenge video that I did with some of my plant friends, every single person who opted to start with a plant that was on clearance either had the plant die on them or had significantly less growth than everyone else competing. Not only fewer leaves, but smaller leaves, less frequently, under pretty much the same lighting conditions. And this is from people who I'd consider experienced growers, so skip the clearance rack if you're looking for the best plants.
My next tip is to find out how wet your soil should be, and a simple Google search will provide some somewhat confusing results. But I think the key is to think about it on a spectrum, with consistently moist on one side and completely dry on the other. Place your store-bought potting soil on one end for consistently moist. If you want your plants to stay wetter for longer, then you use this. As you move from one end of the spectrum to the other, start adding amendments to make your plants drain faster and stay less moist. Things like small perlite, cocoa coir or cocoa husks, large perlite, orchid bark, horticultural charcoal, and sand can really help. A plant like a calathea might want standard potting soil with a tiny bit of added perlite. A plant like a monstera that wants to drain out much faster might want 1 part potting soil, 2 parts perlite, and 2 parts orchid bark. And something like a jade plant or cactus that wants to stay really dry might want 1 part potting soil, 1 part sand, and 1 part charcoal. And let me tell you a little secret, cactus soil is just regular soil with added sand. And while there is no perfect potting mix, a lot of this depends on what you have access to and how you want to live your life. For a monstera, you could make a potting mix with very low soil and lots of other mixes, but this you might have to water every 4 or 5 days. Or you could choose half potting soil and half orchid bark, and then you might be watering your plant once every 7 days. Both of these mixes are viable. It does depend on your lifestyle and how much light and heat your plants are getting. And I will say that buying a high quality potting soil might be the exact thing that you need for a healthier plant overall. Personally, I'm using ProMix high porosity potting soil with mycorrhizae, but something like Fox Farms Ocean Forest or Happy Frog might be something that's more available to you. ProMix is a Canadian brand. And a bonus tip is thinking about what kind of pot type contributes to your plant staying more wet or more dry. An unglazed terracotta pot is porous, so it actually releases more moisture from the plant soil, so that would go on this side of the spectrum. And a plastic pot that's not porous would go on the other side of the spectrum because it's not releasing any extra water. I know how popular moss bowls have become, especially since plants like monstera, philodendron, and even this pothos are some of the most popular plants. Climbing poles, if used correctly, will help you get much larger leaves, but not every plant is considered a vining plant. Some of the most popular philodendron are what's called self-heading philodendron. That's basically when the plant grows its leaves so tightly together and all around that you can't really even see the stem unless the plant is extremely old and some of the older leaves start to fall off. Philodendrons like the red moon, the Congo, the yellow flame, ring of fire, and even the philodendron Birkin are all self-heading philodendrons. Once you know the growth pattern of the plant, you can actually plan ahead to the future and understand what kind of space your plant will need. While these plants generally don't get very tall, they can take up between 3 and 4 feet of space across. So plan ahead and think about what kind of space and lighting these plants will need in the future. Overhead lighting is probably the best for these self-heading philodendrons, so something like a Soltech Aspect Grow Light would help these plants significantly. Plants that we put on poles like this pothos benefit from light coming straight on or at a downward angle so that the leaves are facing towards you.
For the longest time that I owned plants, I had no idea how much light I was getting until I actually bought a light meter. And this one thing has made me realize that most people are getting way less light than they actually think they're getting. So unless your windows are unobstructed, floor to ceiling, facing the best direction, I highly suggest that you get a light meter to figure out what your needs actually are in your space. At around 5 p.m., the floor to ceiling windows in my bedroom with a balcony overhang is about 300 to 400 FC. The exact same windows at the same time of day with no overhang is around 700 FC. A lot of the most common houseplants need between 100 and 200 FC just to survive. That means this window, this window, this window, and this window aren't actually enough for plants to grow well and thrive. Now, they won't die right away, and depending on the plant, this could take months or even years before you start to see them actually struggling. But as soon as you start making any serious changes to the plant, like repotting, replacing soil, or starting fertilizer, this can really accelerate the dying process of the plant. So what should we aim for our plants? For the most part, it should be around 400 FC. At 400 FC for at least 12 hours a day, most plants will get enough light to produce moderately good growth. And yes, it will be enough for a plant like a monstera to get bigger leaves and fenestrate. For higher light plants like cactus, bird of paradise, rubber trees, or fiddle-leaf figs, you should be aiming for around 800 FC. Okay, but what if you want your plants to be amazing? I'm talking like Instagram level amazing. Well, then you should be aiming for 1500 FC. There is such a thing as too much light, and it does depend on the species of the plant. There is a link in the description of a blog post by Daryl Chang of Houseplant Journal to provide some more information on that, but when you're talking about indoor plants, you mostly need to worry about your plants getting too much light too quickly. If your plant doesn't get enough time to slowly acclimatize to new light, it can suffer from sunburn. Under natural light indoors, my large monstera can withstand some spikes of light of up to 6,000 foot candles for short amounts of time. But as long as they're getting towards 1,500 foot candles of light for at least 12 hours a day, your plants are probably going to grow better than 90% of everyone else's. Some light meters use lux, so you might need to use Google to convert lux to FC or vice versa, but basically 1 foot candle equals around 10.8 lux. You can also make these measurements more accurate by using PAR and DLI. Now, PAR stands for photosynthetic active radiation, and it describes the wavelengths that light sits on within the visible range. Now, plants use light differently at different wavelengths, and that's why it's more efficient for us to use something like DLI. DLI, or daily light integral, is a measure of the aggregate amount of PAR light that a surface receives over the course of the day. But before that, you should probably know how to calculate that, so we actually have to backtrack a little bit. And no, I'm not finished. You should also know that PAR is calculated differently based on the type of light source, so light from the sun is actually calculated differently from light from like an LED grow light, so it actually can get a little bit more complicated than that. So what you want to do is